Bienvenidos o bienvenidos de nuevo a este apasionante ciclo de debates sobre el futuro de la ética de la IA, en la que exploramos cuestiones emergentes sobre la ética de la inteligencia artificial con expertos de toda Europa. Mi nombre es Theodore Lechtermam y soy titular de la Càtedra Unesco de Ética y Gobernanza de la IA en la Universidad de Madrid. Es un honor para mí programar este ciclo y una vez más agradezco a la Fundación La Caixa por hacer posible esta colaboración con la Càtedra Unesco. Esta noche hablaremos en inglés, pero habrá traducción simultánea disponible a través de los auriculares. Ahora pasaré al inglés. So the aim of this series is to explore new frontiers in the ethics of AI, where we consider questions that are not yet part of public discourse and new perspectives on familiar questions. Our first session with John Rueda considered whether AI can improve the moral competence of humans, and our second session with Ana Paiva, Henrik Skaug-Saitra, and Julia Pareto considered whether intimate relationships between humans and AI are possible or desirable. Last week, with Vincent Mueller, we debated whether AI could someday enjoy the status of citizenship alongside human beings. And tonight is the final session of the cycle, when we have a very exciting discussion planned. The question of how artificial intelligence might affect the labor market and the conditions of our working lives is now a familiar one. Many people worry that AI could make many jobs obsolete, raising new challenges for distributive justice and human well-being. Is the automation of labor something to be welcomed or resisted? Who might benefit and who might lose from the automation of labor? And how should this issue be managed by governments and organizations? But when it comes to the future of work, are we asking the right kinds of questions and exploring the right kinds of solutions? Well, tonight we have two experts working at the cutting edge of these debates from different perspectives, Kate Vredenberg and Jeremias Adams-Prassl. Kate Vredenberg is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the London School of Economics and holder of a UK Research and Innovation Fellowship investigating worker autonomy and the future of work. Kate's research spans the philosophy of the social sciences and philosophy of technology. She is perhaps most well known for developing the idea of a right to explanation, which has very important implications for artificial intelligence when we talk about black box algorithms and the ethics thereof. Kate studied at Gettysburg College before acquiring a B.Phil from Oxford and a PhD from Harvard. Jeremias Adams-Prassl is professor of law at University of Oxford, where he's also an associate dean and a fellow of Magdalen College. His research investigates work, technology, and the law in Europe and beyond. He is the author of 4 books and the editor of 4 more, and is currently completing a 5-year project on algorithms at work funded by the ERC and the Leverhulme Trust. Jeremias is perhaps most well known for his work analyzing the normative and legal challenges of the gig economy, the subject of his award-winning 2018 book, Humans as a Service. Jeremias completed his graduate studies at Oxford and Harvard, and in addition to his Oxford D.Phil, holds an honorary doctorate from Lund University. I also want to extend a special welcome tonight to alumni from Oxford and Cambridge who are joining us in the audience. So each speaker will talk for 20 minutes or so, and then join me on stage for a panel discussion and questions from the audience. We begin tonight with Kate, so please join me in welcoming Kate Vredenberg.
All right. Thank you, Ted, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you for La Caixa for the wonderful invitation. I'm so happy to be here. So the benefit of going first and having just heard your wonderful co-panelists give a fascinating interview to a journalist is that you can scoop all of the things they said and say them first and pretend that you thought of them. But I think, I'm looking forward to tonight because Jeremias and I have a certain amount of agreement, but come from different angles and we'll be stressing very different things today. So I think when we think about the future of work, and here's one thing I stole from Jeremias just now, there's a tendency to think about how many jobs will there be, will we be more productive, why are these sort of micro-level increases in productivity not showing up in the labor market, but also, right, we potentially have a real opportunity to think not just about who's working, the distribution of jobs, but are those good jobs? Can we manage to combine our jobs with caring and all of this other socially necessary work that we have to do? And so today I want to do something somewhat unusual, which is try to present a kind of positive vision for AI in the future of work. So rightfully so, right? Oftentimes you hear about the need for regulation to avoid harms, extremely important. But of course, we also need regulation to set out a kind of positive vision for what a good society should look like. And I think behind that regulation should be some kind of values driving how we think the labor market should be shaped in tandem with AI. So that's what I'll talk about today. So, the kind of impacts of AI on work is a lot more than the automation of jobs. So we can think about two initial alternative or kind of other ways that AI can impact work besides automating away jobs altogether. There's a big sphere of algorithmic management. So how AI is used to manage workers, issues around data privacy, surveillance and control, manipulation. But there's also this big new field of working with AI. So raise your hand if you've used an AI agent or kind of AI chatbot in the past week. Anyone? ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini? Yeah, it's amazing. So, before I think often the use of AI was really hidden from us, right? So if you were doing work delivering groceries, say, through a delivery platform, AI was very apparent to you, right? It was managing the jobs that you got, how quickly you needed to complete them. But oftentimes, as kind of citizens or as workers, AI was really behind the screen. You were working around your laptop. You didn't know that your employer was analyzing everything you were doing with AI. It wasn't kind of in your face in this way. But now we've all got AI on our devices. We can collaborate very directly with it. Our employer might not know that we're doing it. And these AI agents are really changing work. So what I want to ask today is a kind of particular question. How can we, again, set out this positive vision for how we could work with AI, kind of work better using AI? So first, right, in the project that Ted mentioned and the kind of first big topic that I'm going to talk about today, how can we work autonomously with AI? So there's a kind of negative vision, which many, many workers experience, right, of being directed movement by movement with AI. So you work in a warehouse, you've got something in your ear, it's telling you how to move every minute, your movements need to be legible to the AI system. But you could think of a more positive way of working with AI, that it makes you more free, more autonomous, more in control of your work. And that's what I'm going to explore today. And then the second question is, how can we make work more flexible, increasing the access to work for a range of different people? So you might think about people with disabilities who need certain accommodations, working at home, not being able to work certain hours, people with caregiving responsibilities who might need to pick up their children. Can we use AI to make our working day more flexible so we can fit all of these other things into our working day rather than have our lives revolve around work? So this first question, how can we work autonomously with AI? This I'm doing in conjunction with my co-author, Dr. Meyer from the University of Hamburg. And we're asking two kind of questions. Actually, what is it to work autonomously with these AI agents? What does that mean? And then secondly, what regulation could we put in place in order to make sure that people can work autonomously with AI? So there's this kind of common notion that you find in regulation or in the social sciences. I think also it's maybe appealing that to be autonomous, to be free in your work, is to have control, right? So you're really autonomous at work if your boss tells you, Kate, you have to finish that paper by Friday, and I can say, no, I absolutely do not. It can wait until Monday. I'm going home early, and we think Kate is highly autonomous in her workplace. And I think this kind of vision of being autonomous as having this control has led to this kind of human-in-the-loop regulation, where what we need is a human being who kind of stands at the top of the process. And then, per this little cartoon, right, the AI is doing a bunch of stuff. You don't totally understand why it's doing it. And you just click a button at the end that says yes or no. And maybe it has some terrible consequences that you didn't even envision. And you might think, in some sense, you have control. You're in the loop. But it wouldn't strike us that this is highly autonomous. And so in order to investigate this question of how we can work autonomously with AI, we actually use AI in order to interview workers at scale and ask them, how is AI changing your work? What do you think good work looks like with AI? And what would you want to see the future bring? And we also, on the basis of this, do a kind of conceptual analysis and argue for a certain notion of autonomy at work. So here are just some interesting themes from the interviews. I have some text on the slide, lots and lots of interesting stuff. But one is, so in English, the way that this was put is someone said, look, I don't want to be a babysitter for AI. I don't want to be in the background kind of supervising AI while it does all the interesting work. That doesn't feel very autonomous to me. I might be in the loop, right? But I don't want to babysit these systems. A second point that people often made is, well, what's really important to me is to be using my own judgment. So it shouldn't be that a system makes an expert recommendation and I just follow it. I want to be thinking about these hard moral questions. I want to be dealing with clients, helping them manage trade-offs, all of these kind of judgment-based things. And finally, this question of responsibility. So interestingly, right, you might think of autonomy as being counter to responsibility, that I'm really free, I'm really autonomous if I have very few responsibilities. But what people said is, actually, I want to be a locus of responsibility for my coworkers, and I want them to see me as that and trust me, to kind of take me to have this authority. So we combine this in this view that actually to be autonomous when you're working with these AI agents is to continue to be what we call the kind of author of your work, that you're using these AI tools, but ultimately you feel that I was the kind of author, creator of this ultimate product, and my peers recognize me as such, and for example, I have the kind of authority to be held responsible, make a final judgment, resolve these hard questions. And I think, interestingly, right, this leads us to two sort of very broad brushstroke ideas when it comes to regulation. Well, maybe on the one hand, what we need to do is just fully automate some processes. The worst is this kind of, in-between where, yeah, I have to be in the loop, but I'm not really doing any of the groundwork. I don't really understand what's going on. I just have to press the final yes or no button. This needs to go away. Instead, either we can say, look, we trust it. We've fully automated this process. Sure, we have some kind of checks at the very end, but I'm not hand-holding AI throughout the whole process. Or we need to design in a way that really preserves this authorship, this human autonomy that really augments human intelligence. So I kind of started off with all of these questions of autonomy, which you might think what we really want is to people be more involved in their work, have more scope in their work, have discretion, have authorship. And I think there's a really interesting potential tension or other thing we might want out of work, which is precisely this idea of flexibility and opportunity. So, the more that work involves long hours, lots of discretion, lots of responsibility, lots of ownership, the worse it can be, for example, for women in the workplace. So how should we trade off these two things? And how can we use AI to make work more accessible to women? Sorry. So one of the major issues around kind of the accessibility of work is the so-called gender wage gap as created by these greedy jobs. So many jobs are paid much more, kind of paid a premium for people working long hours, being constantly available to clients, all of these things that are really incompatible with childcare. So take the advantage of being a lawyer, right? The example, why do people pay for lawyers? Well, for their expertise, but also for things like they're on call, they can meet tight deadlines, all of these things that are very, you might think, incompatible with significant caring responsibilities. But there are some really interesting examples of the use of technology to make work more flexible in this desirable way. So flexible in the sense of the worker can kind of influence when they work, how much they work, but there's plenty of work available for them. They're able to come and work regularly, but they just have a lot more choice over when and how they work. So there's a nice study by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz where they look at this example of pharmacies in the United States. So to be a pharmacist, it used to be you worked long hours, it was a very male-dominated profession, but actually technology was one of the drivers of a change in that. And one of the main factors behind this was in the rise of insurance companies in the United States and the use of these common databases. So before you would go to your pharmacy, and someone would tell you, you'd have your same pharmacist, they'd know in your head, or they'd written down very messily on a piece of paper, oh, Kate is taking these medications, so she shouldn't take this one. Now I can see a new pharmacist in a new city. They can look up all of my medications, right, through this common database, and they can say, oh, don't worry, yep, this new medication is fine, have a wonderful day. And so this means that someone can be a pharmacist and work 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., pick up their children. Someone else can take over for the night shift. There's absolutely no problem in allowing workers this kind of flexibility because they're more substitutable for each other. And I think, just to end, right, there's a real opportunity here, but there's also a real danger. So as we might get to, what we've seen, for example, is that in the gig economy is workers are highly substitutable, but this has really negative impact on their well-being. So they have a kind of, they take on a lot of risk, they're fired at the last minute. So there's really the question of, can we use AI to get this desirable kind of flexibility, but have the appropriate regulation in the background to make sure that we don't end up with workers who are actually much worse off than they would have been before we introduced this technology. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. And please join me in welcoming Jeremias Adams-Prassl.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Kaisha, for the kind invitation. Thank you, Kate, for a really interesting talk. I have to admit, it's a bit of anxiety coming to these beautiful interdisciplinary events. We hear really interesting empirical work. We hear really interesting philosophical thoughts. And then as a lawyer, I have to tell you about the GDPR. So I hope you will forgive me if I do some law, but I will try to think about different impacts that technology has on the future of work. Also, do you mind if I grab the clicker? Perfect. So I promise we didn't coordinate this too much, but Ted sent us an email independently, both Kate and myself, and said, look, it's going to be a conversation about the future of work. What do you want to talk about? And we had overlapping emails because both of us replied saying, we want to think about the demise of human agency. And I think it's really, really interesting that, as Kate has said, usually when people talk about the impact of AI on work, it's all these stories about we're all going to lose our jobs, right? The robots are coming, we'll all be unemployed on the streets, and then maybe let's have a conversation about UBI or various other ways of dealing with that. And I think that's a huge distraction, and that's why I'm so happy that tonight we can have a conversation not about this impact on the quantity of jobs, because these predictions happen every century, right? Ricardo has a go at it, Keynes has a go at it, etc., etc. It doesn't happen for various reasons. What it's distracting us from is a discussion about the impact that technology has not on the quantity of jobs, but on the quality of jobs. What happens in other ways when technology starts to augment or even fully replace various aspects of traditional tasking, of traditional work. And that, I think, is the fundamental challenge that we need to think about much more than we have done to date. It is, as I put in my work, this demise of human agency. What do I mean by the demise of human agency? Well, one thing we've seen is that AI, even though it hasn't destroyed workers' jobs, has come for a lot of traditional management tasks. This started in the gig economy with the likes of Uber and Deliveroo, but today has come to workplaces right across the socioeconomic spectrum. Most things that a boss would have traditionally done, from hiring workers to managing them on a day-to-day basis, all the way through to firing them, has now become fully automated. Again, you might think that's potentially quite attractive, right? Bosses can be pretty unpleasant people. So, if my boss loses her job to an algorithm, great news. Turns out that the algorithmic boss can, in the words of author and journalist Tom Slee, quickly become the boss from hell. Why is it that we should care about this loss of human agency? Well, there's a practical dimension to human agency in management. This idea that flexibility, that various forms of mercy are really important when it comes to interactions in the workplace. There's also huge moral or sort of dignitarian concerns when it comes to fully automating traditional management. Imagine you get fired from your job, but you find out when you try to log in the morning and your account no longer works. And then you try to challenge that termination, but all you get is an automatically generated email. That's not some science fiction scenario, that's the daily life of an Uber driver. Your score falls below a certain threshold and your account simply no longer works. More fundamentally, and this is my interest particularly as a lawyer, human agency is very much at the core of the bureaucratic structures of management and the workplace. And human agency is how, as lawyers, we assign responsibility. Generally speaking, in most legal systems, the more control you have over a particular scenario, the more likely will the law be to ascribe responsibility to you for what's going on. The danger, and I call this the control accountability paradox in my work, the danger with AI management is that we can now exercise control to a degree that would have been unimaginably close without technology. Yet at the same time, responsibility disperses into the cloud. Let me give you a very concrete example from litigation in Baltimore a couple of years ago, when there was an allegation against management in a major warehouse for sacking workers because they tried to set up a trade union. And the defense that management ran in this particular plant was to say that even though we employ about 350 people, we neither know nor understand or even control the system that fires our workers. We have a fully automated productivity system, and we don't know how it works. On the facts of that case, that was a pretty genius defense, because remember, it's a case about union victimization, and you can say, actually, we didn't target particular workers. But take a step back and think about this notion that you're employing 350 people, and you neither understand nor control perhaps the most fundamental decision, who gets sacked any one day. It was that story that sort of struck with me as thinking, well, as lawyers, we also really need to start thinking about agency. And in particular, we need to start thinking about what can the law actually do to restore human agency in this world of AI. Now, if you are a lawyer, you might say, well, Jeremias, actually it's pretty straightforward. We have a clear answer what to do here. There is Article 22 of the GDPR. We've already heard about this notion of the human in the loop. As lawyers, we've got a slightly less attractive way of putting it. We have the ban on fully automated decisions. Or in other words, in Article 22, paragraph 1, the right not to be subject to a fully automated decision if it has a meaningful impact on the data subject. Great. You might say, we've got this ban on automated decision-making, end of the story. It's an ancient right, for technological terms. It's a right that's anchored in a lot of constitutional settlements. French law, German law, various other jurisdictions across the EU have even recognized it as a constitutional imperative, directly linked to notions of human self-determination, of human agency. And yet, when you start to carefully peel back the layers on the right to human decision, it turns out that it doesn't actually do the job it's designed to do. First of all, there's lots of questions as to how it should actually apply in practice. You look at a sort of modern AI system, we're looking at very high-dimensional systems with lots and lots of decisions. So this notion of even identifying what the one decision is extremely tricky, and courts have struggled to work it out. There's also various technical problems when we think about how it should actually operate in a system. Kate has already told us about the problems that come from human-machine interaction. Indeed, there's concerns that if I put a human somewhere in the loop of decision-making process, that can create worse decisions overall than fully automating decisions or leaving them fully in the control of the human. There's also concerns that all the human or in the loop might do is actually end up protecting the system rather than protecting those subject to decisions. Eilish has this great piece where she talks about the human in the loop as the moral crumple zone. Are you familiar with the notion of the crumple zone? In your car, you've got this bit that if you have an accident, one thing sort of deliberately crushes, takes out all the energy and protects the driver. Well, what Eilish suggests is if we've got the human in the loop, rubber stamping each decision, if then something goes wrong with the AI system, it's the little human that gets squashed. We blame the human and protect the system that's actually caused the error in the first place. There's also a real issue with focusing on individual decisions, because a lot of the harms we're interested in with AI systems don't necessarily crystallize at the level of the individual decisions. A lot of the harms we're thinking about are actually system level, systemic harms that happen across populations. And so focusing legally on just the one human decision might not actually make sense. Could keep going on and tell you about all these cases where even very straightforward questions as to how we should apply Article 22 don't work out when judges have to decide them, how we get contradictory decisions all over the European Union. Instead, what I want to tell you about is the prescription my team and I have been working on, thinking through what we can do to protect human agency in moving beyond and focus on the human in the loop. And what we suggest in very concrete terms is to shift our focus from the human in the loop, from the human decision, to humans and the loop, to human agency at various processes, at various aspects of the decision-making process. The first thing we suggest is to have various provisions in place for humans before the loop, to involve humans, to give agency through the shaping of automated decision-making before we actually deploy the system. Straightforwardly, you could do this through various transparency requirements, even just making people aware of the fact that these exist. But we also want the involvement of workers when it comes to shaping and deploying the systems. Some jurisdictions in Europe have already introduced certain rules along those lines, but you could think of some form of works council, some form of social dialogue that says, okay, there's this new software we've got, here are the promises, how are we going to deploy this in a particular work setting? What are the features that we think will be generally helpful? What are the features that we think are pretty creepy and we should definitely not deploy them? Once a system is designed, and by the way, I'm pretty sure, my Spanish is ropey, but I'm pretty sure that's an AI translation getting humans above the loop wrong. But you can tell me about the quality afterwards. Essentially, we also want system-level control by having humans placed above the loop, above the operation of the automated system. That means supervision. That means a continuous looking at, say, samples of decision. But it also crucially means system-level impact assessment. So, for example, when it comes to AI recruitment, one of the first employment functions that very extensively has been automated, in any one recruitment decision, the impact of various biases is very hard to detect. If an applicant with a particular set of protected characteristics has a slightly lower chance of being selected, it's technically very hard to work that out. However, if I look across the population of candidates that have been recruited in a year and map that against protected characteristics, usually the various biased and discriminatory impacts of systems are very easy to spot, and you can then put relevant measures to mitigate those harms in place. And so again, rather than this focus on the individual decision, what we need is actually a shift towards system-level impacts of AI in the workplace. Despite having humans before the loop, despite having the system-level monitoring, of course, things can still go wrong in various circumstances. And so that's why the third broad category of provisions we suggest are provisions for having humans after the loop. And here we're really talking about different forms of contestation and potentially rectification of the automated decision-making. So the idea is that, sure, we can, again, as Kate has already said, we can fully automate certain decisions. There can be very meaningful decisions I don't necessarily care about. If I get the job, don't care whether a human interviewed me or whether it was an automated system. On the other hand, particularly when we're looking at adverse impacts, we may well want to be in a position to say, hang on a second, can you explain this decision to me? Oh, you didn't take these particular factors into account, even though I think they're very salient. I want you to rectify the decision in light of the correct information. And those of you who have a legal background might be aware that under data protection rules, we've always had a debate about the extent to which such rights already exist in data protection law generally. Well, what we'd need from a specific law putting into place context-specific rules for work is crystallizing such rights in the context of social dialogue of the workplace. And that indeed brings me to my conclusion. This is, how can we actually go about doing this? Well, Spain is a really interesting case study because Spain, through the ley rider, actually was at the forefront of creating a basic set of rights for workers in the gig economy when it came to algorithms replacing management. And that was a major inspiration for legislation at the European level known as the Platform Work Directive, which is currently being implemented across all 27 member states, and which actually has concrete illustrations of these new forms of humans before, after, and above the loop as a way of replacing the human in the loop. There are certain decisions, such as firing workers, but we have suggested that we will always need human decision-making. But in a lot of other contexts, I think we've reached a point, both in terms of the sort of way the technology is deployed, but also how we think about the importance of smart regulation, that we move beyond the human in the loop and instead have these different forms of shaping and contesting automation at work. In conclusion, I think it's fair to say that, yes, there are definitely positive aspects of these technologies. As I started out with saying, in the workplace, it's really interesting to think of the counterfactual. We often think about biased algorithms. We think about algorithms getting it wrong. But employment lawyers wouldn't have a job if human bosses were these perfect, always nice, always correct individuals. So let's, by all means, think about the human counterfactual when it comes to assessing new technologies. And that's important because I think we mustn't fall for a story of technological exceptionalism, a story of path dependencies of saying, well, these technologies are brand new, they're fundamentally different from what has come before, and therefore all these boring old laws of employment and discrimination and data protection no longer apply. That is fundamentally wrong. Just because the technology is new does not mean that existing rules no longer apply. However, and at the same time as thinking about how we apply and enforce existing norms, we do need to think about gaps. And I think, and this is why I think I really look forward to a discussion that we're now going to have, the demise of managerial agency is one of these fundamental gaps that we see with new technology. And that the traditional legal prescription of having the right to human decision is no longer enough to fill. What we need instead, as I hope I've convinced you this evening, is a shift from the human decision to novel mechanisms for fostering and protecting human agency. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. So I'd like to start actually with a legal question. It may be my one and only legal question tonight, since it's not my field of expertise. But I would imagine this question is also in the minds of many of our audience members. Right? Jeremias, you mentioned the GDPR, which in sort of technology law terms is sort of a dinosaur at this point, though it's stood up to the test of time. But the question would be, if the GDPR hasn't solved the problem of the demise of human managerial agency, don't we have a brand new, robust piece of legislation in Europe that is supposed to solve this problem and every other problem with artificial intelligence, the European AI Act? Hasn't the AI Act solved this problem, or why hasn't it?
Thank you, Ted. This is one of my favorite bêtes noires, so bear with me. I should say a few things before I launch into a massive assault on the AI Act. First of all, I absolutely believe that AI needs to be regulated at the European Union level, right? So nothing which I'm about to say should suggest in any way, shape or form that I don't think the EU should do this. I just think it's been done wrong in this particular case. The second thing I should say as a positive is that the AI Act tries to do two things. It tries to, on the one hand, support innovation and technological development in the internal market, right? The very explicit goal is that we're going to have one set of rules instead of 27 set of rules. So for investors and for innovators, there's a very clear level playing field across the member states. That's goal number one, market making. The second goal is protecting the fundamental rights of Europe's citizens. Whether it's citizens as workers, citizens as consumers, citizens as patients, citizens as people living in the environment. And what the AI Act tries to do is achieve both of those goals. Create a good market for innovation and protect citizens' basic fundamental rights. Again, that's a great thing as an inspiration for AI regulation. Now for the bad news and then the ugly news. The bad news is that the AI Act fundamentally fails to achieve either of those goals. It does so for two reasons. First of all, it commits a fundamental category error by choosing a particular regulatory model, which is known as product regulation. I can knock all of you to sleep right now if I go into a detailed explanation of how EU product rules work. But essentially, the EU has a very successful regime for making sure that physical products are safe. You know the CE label you see on the back of your battery or your phone or your face mask? It's a great way of making sure products are safe. But it's for physical products, and it's primarily designed to stop physical harms from happening. It's designed to have clear technocratic standards so that batteries don't blow up. That system has now been used to try and regulate AI, where AI is not a physical product, it keeps developing, and the harms we're interested in tend to be immaterial harms. Bias, discrimination, subtle disadvantaging of particular groups, etc., etc. Deep, fundamental, philosophical, ethical issues that are not as easy to answer as what's the wattage for a battery so it doesn't blow up. And the second big problem with the AI Act, and there actually I think to some extent it links back to a problem we see in the GDPR, is that it tries to have one overall regulatory regime for AI in lots of different contexts, when actually it's becoming increasingly clear that both the advantages and the drawbacks of AI are very different in different contexts. AI is deployed in medical and healthcare is very different from AI in finance, is very different from AI when it comes to the world of work. And so actually what we do need, instead of one overarching instrument focused on a particular kind of technology, is much more technology neutral applications and regulations that say we're going to focus on particular contexts. And that's why I think the Platform Work Directive is such an interesting sort of juxtaposition to the AI Act. The AI Act tries to regulate a particular technology in lots of different contexts, and it's not going to work. It's going to cause all sorts of red tape for business, and it's not going to protect fundamental rights. Platform Work Directive, on the other hand, has in a sense a much more humble goal, but will therefore be much more effective. It looks specifically at the deployment of technology, not just AI, any form of automation in the workplace, but then can also have context-specific tailored responses to what's happening.
So if I understand you correctly, the idea is that the AI Act does many things, has many virtues, but in some ways it's the wrong framework, and it's overly broad to handle the issue of a right to a human decision nimbly and comprehensively, as well as to deal with the kinds of questions that we're asking now about autonomy and flexibility in the workplace. These are totally outside the scope of the AI Act. Is that right?
Absolutely. And the AI Act does recognize the challenges of the workplace. We've seen various amendments during the parliamentary debate and discussions to introduce some rights for the workplace. Mm-hmm. But again, because it does so in the framework of this overarching technology, it's very hard to actually then feel more like little bolt-ons than a fundamental rethink of how the regulatory approach should work.
Yeah, great. So I have a kind of similar question for each of you, and I'll start with Kate. So, Kate, it was very interesting talking about some of your empirical research, so experimental philosophy, with Dr. Marco Meyer. Exploring, asking actual workers, what is it like to work with AI? What are you afraid of? What do you value, etc. And sort of one of the findings that you mentioned was that people are worried about losing the opportunity to engage in judgment-sensitive tasks, to engage in critical reflection, the sort of higher order mental faculties that we value to a great extent in our working lives. And so, the hope for some people is that we could preserve or even amplify the extent to which we exercise those faculties, and we can minimize the extent to which we're required to engage in routine, deadening, dangerous, stultifying tasks at work. But my worry is that we may have a bit of false consciousness about this very issue. Many people enjoy the sort of administrative and routine aspects of their jobs as a way to take a break from the sort of very taxing mental activity of the sort of judgment-sensitive, high-responsibility tasks. And it can be a way, thinking of myself, as a researcher, as an author, sometimes I'm doing administrative work and it allows me to sort of reflect on things sort of in the background. Thoughts are percolating. So is this a concern for you at all? Are you worried about perhaps preserving too much judgment-sensitive tasks for humans when we do in fact, perhaps, or maybe I'm unique, we do in fact enjoy or value having some aspect of these sort of low mental level activities going on?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I definitely worry from a few angles.
Yeah.
So the first worry is really an empirical worry about being self-deceived, as you brought out. So there have been some really interesting studies. So when you interview, for example, coders using AI, basically across the board, people will say, I'm faster, I'm way more productive, I'm getting things done with AI. Then you actually look at you measure objectively how long it takes them to do things. Usually people are slower. Feels faster to them, maybe. We could give all kinds of explanations of that, but in fact, they're slower. So you can imagine a similar worry here, right? People are saying, I love dealing with clients. I love getting into the hard normative issues. I hate doing all that admin. And then you ask them if they had a very client-heavy, judgment-heavy, responsibility-heavy week. How was your week? They're like, I hate it. I'm quitting work. I'm totally burnt out. So we may actually just all be self-deceived about that. Another kind of worry or thing that we ought to recognize is just huge diversity among workers. So a thing that also came up in the interviews was people said, hey, I actually like debugging code. I actually like being the one who does all of these routine admin tasks. I don't want AI to take that away from me. And there's just a huge difference in the kind of work that people find enjoyable. So that's often why, for philosophers, if you're a so-called kind of liberal in political philosophy, what you will say is, well, actually what we need to do is put in place workplace regulations and give people resources to allow them to have kind of access to opportunities to achieve what they view as a good job, but not prescribe to people you always ought to be doing those kind of judgment-heavy tasks. So what we might worry about is more all of them going away because of AI, and what we shouldn't then do is say, well, everyone ought to be doing this kind of work, right? It's a little bit the philosopher's view of what good work is. Good work is like thinking by yourself and doing all of these cognitive tasks. And I think maybe the final thing to stress is what was really interesting in these interviews was really the kind of social and relational element. So you might have thought, well, actually what people want to do, they're all coders, right? They're working by themselves in a basement. They want to exercise their judgment. But actually there's a lot of, I like relating to people. I like the sociality of my work. I don't want to lose that. So oftentimes when we think about kind of what we're aiming to achieve with AI, we see these notions are heavily interrelated, right? People might want more autonomy, but also so they can have better relationships with people in the workplace. So in a way, we need to keep all of these building blocks in our mind, as well as the kind of diversity of things people want. So this makes it very difficult to kind of theorize about this. And I think, again, why a good approach is give people opportunities and the kind of resources to achieve them, and a rich labor market that presents them with all those opportunities rather than prescribe for people one kind of work.
Right. And so my somewhat parallel question for Jeremias is, this idea of the demise of human managerial agency as being a bad thing, I think many people's initial reaction would be the opposite, right? Many of us would wish that our managers had less agency. Can you say a little bit more about why this is something for us to actually, be concerned about?
Absolutely. And I think it boils down to a number of factors, right? So the first one, as I sort of hinted at, is this very practical aspect of human agency, right? If there's sort of, if you turn up late for work the third time and, the weather is horrible and it's sort of snowing outside, etc., you might expect a human boss, or at least sort of, your average human boss, to have some empathy for that fact, right? Some flexibility. They recognize the fact that, maybe you had to drop off your kids on the way to work, and actually, it's very treacherous out there with all the snow and the ice, so you're a bit late, right? So there's simply this kind of sort of practical aspect. Again, I go into sort of dangerous territory here talking about this in front of philosophers, but my sense is that things like mercy, again, is something that, depends very much on an element of human agency. And so this notion that we could automate the exercise of mercy in some way, shape or form runs counter to the fact that, we build a system of rules and then enforce it, when mercy is the exact opposite. I also do think, and again, I personally don't do empirical work, but there is a lot of empirical work done on these kind of alienation effects of automation, right? This idea that actually, even if you might not like it, at least having a human boss tell you what to do gives you some sense of agency for yourself as well in the workplace, right? It's even, you might hate the fact that your boss walks around the workplace, but at least when she's walking around, so you can quickly, close the Amazon tab where you've been shopping or whatever it is you're doing when you're meant to be working, right? Very different when you just know that there's a plugin installed that takes a screenshot at random intervals every couple of minutes, which is how a lot of online labor platforms, for example, ask their workers to be monitored during digital tasks. So I think there's that element as well. There's also a lot of work done on how we sort of receive instructions, right? So one thing that, again, starts in the gig economy, but we now see more and more through automation of tasks, is that the way managerial control is exercised can become very subtle. So, for example, rather than when a driver tries to log off and an app still needs more work, rather than just letting me click the log off button, it might show me a screen saying, are you sure you want to log off? Because actually, lots of earnings could be just around the corner. And then the default button to press would be to say, okay, I'll continue to drive. Alex Rosenblatt and her colleague Luke Stark were the first ones who did a lot of sort of empirical work on that. Again, with sort of modern software, you get things like you could have an email that you get at the end of the working day as you're just about to log off to say, Jeremias, you promised to send your slides to Ted and Kate. Are you sure you want to leave now and not do that beforehand? Now, you could say, well, these things are optional, right? I can't just click them away. But when you look at sort of various both empirical work, but also again some of the philosophical dimensions of power and control, actually, having a big stick and making you do something is one thing. Conditioning your choice set so that you want to drive longer might actually be even more power I exercise over you. So again, I think these are some of the sort of non-legal concerns why I think this sort of automation is quite tricky. And this is before we get to the fact that who's going to be responsible, right? Which is then the sort of more legal concern about, we need these bureaucratic structures because that is where we pin responsibility at the end of the day.
Right. But if you project into the future, do you imagine artificially intelligent systems becoming more agentic and more autonomous in a way where they could perhaps exercise mercy or hold responsibility in a legal sense and thus deal with these kinds of problems? Or does that open new kinds of worms?
Well, I suppose to some extent I could say Ted is very cleverly trying to sneak a question about AGI in here, right? Will we have a sort of generalized artificial intelligence? And my sense is, might that be possible one day? Who knows? Everything I'm seeing suggests it's not. And that, again, every time you get some sort of moral panic about, we now have AGI, it turns out that, Claude bots talking to each other is mostly just, they sound like Reddit because they were trained on Reddit, right? And so even if that were to happen one day, to be honest, and this is my sort of general response to AGI or X-risk kind of concerns. Well, the fact that that might happen is nice and interesting, but that doesn't distract me and certainly shouldn't distract me from the concerns that right now human bosses definitely do have these facilities, whereas automated bosses certainly do not have mercy at the moment, do not have that flexibility. Yeah. So in a sense, for the what should we do right now question, what might happen one in the future is not necessarily immediately the core thing to be worried about.
Yeah, good. Kate, let me ask you about inequality. Thinking about the positive case or potential positive case that you presented about, integrating AI into our working lives, this idea that, in some ways, depending on how we manage it, integrating AI into our working lives could allow us to be more autonomous, could allow us to enjoy more flexibility in our working lives. As I was listening to you, I was thinking, well, is that going to be the case for everybody? Or could it be the case that, those who are already in privileged positions will be able to reap the benefits of the sort of autonomy-enhancing AI, the flexibility-enhancing AI, while others are, in fact, consigned to, roles where their job is merely to tend to the machines? And sort of one example sort of stood out to me thinking about flexibility, right? If we imagine that AI tools are available to people across the board, some people have extensive caregiving duties. And so they're using the AI tool to sort of manage their productivity over the day to a reasonable level. But people without caregiving duties are using the AI tool to maximize, to increase their productivity by threefold, tenfold, which then sort of resets the bar and then seems to put the people with caregiving duties at a disadvantage. So how are you thinking about, the place of inequality when thinking about, the positive case for AI at work?
It's a really important question, and I think one thing that comes out of both of our presentations is it's really the background organizational structures, regulation, workers' bargaining power compared to capital that's going to determine who and how is able to take advantage of these kind of changes in the use of AI. So in my own field of academia and across many fields, I'm absolutely worried about these kind of increased demands for productivity, even if, in fact, the work is not getting better, but where some people just won't be able to keep up, either because they lack the necessary skills or because they just don't have the time. And so there you might think, as a society, we have to ask ourselves, well, first of all, are we being more productive with AI? And I think it's a real puzzle that we're in, right? It seems in the individual level, it looks like we are. The aggregate level looks like we're not. But let's just say we could all manage to be much more productive with AI. Do we want to be more productive with AI? So, here we might hopefully contrast Europe, Spain or Germany or France with the United States. People work much more in the United States. There are a bunch of explanations for why that is, but it's a choice, right? We've reached a certain level of material production, technological development, where we can choose, are we taking all of this, technology that we have and putting it towards more leisure or more work activity? And we may decide as a society and introduce regulations like working time directives, limiting the work week, to say, look, you just can't use AI to work more hours or produce much more than your colleagues. And I think exactly these kind of things will be necessary in order to kind of create the effects that I talked about, so that we don't just have, okay, sure, in theory, right, we could have flexible work, but some people are really going to get the gains from being in the office for all those hours, using their 100 AI agents to make more and more and more stuff for more and more reports, right? We can't be rewarding that kind of behavior in their promotion and pay and all of these kind of things. So yeah, it's not going to be a kind of magical fix on its own. Background inequalities are going to kind of, with AI, breed more background inequalities unless we intervene.
So, both of you have presented, not quite sunny outlooks, but, you've given us some reasons for a hope about a possible future of working with AI. But I'm wondering just how optimistic you are about the prospects of, the ability to do the kinds of things that you've suggested. The forces that may be conspiring against us, what are you worried about? What do you think is standing in the way of solving these kinds of problems? Maybe starting with Jeremias.
I think one of the biggest traps is a sense of sort of tech determinism, right? This kind of sense that this is stuff that is just happening to us. It's inevitable, this is progress, it's linear, and this is how things are. I think we need to be really, really clear that we have a very strong sense of agency, and that actually stories, so one story you hear a lot, and I sit at a lot of these panels, and something that always comes up is the black box, right? And sort of like, well, how could all this possibly work if there's a black box? Aren't these systems so complicated, so sophisticated that we can't possibly begin to understand them? And therefore, any sort of idea that you're going to apply the law as it is to these systems is just silly. Well, my standard response to that is to say that, first of all, there is a lot of technical stuff we can now do to understand what's going on in systems. And second, the ultimate black box is the human mind. And all we've been doing as lawyers for the last 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years is invent fictions and invent tools to get around the fact that we don't know what's going on inside the human mind. Lawyers will always talk about intention, foreseeability, negligence, reasonableness, good faith, etc., etc. These are all legal fictions we've created to deal with the human mind that is a black box. So this notion that somehow this new technology is coming our way and therefore we can't possibly do anything about it, or that existing rules no longer apply, I think we need to be very, very careful and very, very suspicious of.
Okay.
I worry about so many things. So, geopolitical conflict and the rise of authoritarianism. So, if you're a country around the world, right, you've got basically two major producers of technology, the US and China. So there's the question of how can, countries develop enough kind of digital sovereignty to make their own choices and chart their own path. And we hear a lot of talk of this in the EU. And I think, right, governments need to recognize this is a big investment task. You're not going to be able to give some startup €1 million in Berlin, and they're not going to make the next whatever big breakthrough in AI is, right? This is going to be a huge scientific and economic endeavor in order to be competitive, but it's important. So I think the kind of geopolitical situation is something I worry about, and also inequality. So I do worry about a future where there are a bunch of, call them high-performing, but anyways, capital owners, people using AI to reap huge economic rewards, have huge influence over politics, and the rest of us will be the kind of working proletariat who, we have some kind of job, we're able to make a living, but we're not enjoying the economic success, and maybe our government's not really giving us the interesting resources to enjoy all this leisure time that we have, and our jobs are just kind of humdrum or so-so. So I worry both about kind of geopolitical conflict and the huge economic inequality that's the background for these developments in technology.
Interesting how, we've been talking about the way technology might erode our agency and ways to work around that, but we're also concerned about our sort of lack of self-determination over our policy choices in general, not only because of technological forces, but because of various other kinds of forces that seem to be conspiring against us.
Yeah, exactly. And, my worry is AI just makes all of those trends worse, that we kind of need these background institutional solutions that are smart about technology, that are taking the right approach, but also have a wider purview rather than just AI itself, because, there's no kind of necessity to how AI develops, but also it could be a huge boon. Who knows, right? But it's just going to depend on how our policies shake out, and this is a thing about which I think many people feel kind of hopeless or despondent about having any kind of influence.
And I think, I don't fundamentally disagree with anything in Kate's diagnosis. I think, though, there is a way of framing these things, these sort of, crises, as opportunities as well, right? And so I, over the course of the last year, served on an expert commission for the Spanish government, where we were looking about the impact that some of these sort of crises have on enterprise and what worker ownership and worker voice in the enterprise could do in line with some provisions in the Spanish constitution. And we started looking at what's going on, and you can pretty quickly draw up a pretty scary and depressing list, right? Whether we talk about environmental crises, whether we're talking about technological crises, whether we talk about social crises. But the reality is that these moments of rupture also create opportunities. So when you look at industrial sociology, the introduction of new technologies in the workplace is always a point at which pre-existing implicit bargains get reshaped. And there's absolutely nothing to suggest that the introduction of AI in the workplace will be different from other technologies. Coming up with new fancy software fundamentally changes the power dynamics and various relationships in the workplace. Now, we could just throw our hands up and say, well, this is how it is, and then it's all going to be one-sided, and it's going to happen one day. That's not the only way it has to happen. It can also be the moment where we say, well, actually, fine, everything's up for grabs. Let's have a conversation about how we want to allocate these various rights, bonuses, benefits, etc. in the workplace. And I think that's why, without at all disagreeing with the fact that, yes, there is a very scary list of crises out there, just saying, well, that means we're all screwed and doomed, maybe I'm being naive, but my hope is that, that's not the only outcome from that.
And that's one thing I really liked from your proposal. So it wasn't just like, look, let's get back to the human managerial status quo, but with AI. It was, look, actually, AI can help us do things that we think always should have been done in the workplace, but in fact were not done either ever or to the extent that we think they ought to. So, take anyone who's ever not been hired. Have you ever had any kind of successful contestation process? But actually maybe having more data, maybe having a partly automated process can help us do this better. So I think taking it as an opportunity to say, like, look, here are a bunch of things that we're trying to achieve with regulation that actually maybe we can achieve much better with AI was a really nice part of the proposal.
Yeah. And it is true that technology does sort of thrust a new spotlight on topics, right? I mean, again, as Ted was saying, I've done a lot of work on the gig economy, and from a labor market perspective, I hate to say this, but there's nothing new at all about the gig economy, right? The various forms of exploitation that we see in a lot of gig economy business models through subcontracting, through extreme short-term contracts, through 0 hours setups, through precarious work being core to the business model, through sham self-employment where I make you sign a thing saying you're an independent contractor. That stuff is decades old. That stuff is as old as employment law itself, right? People have been writing about the dangers of fake self-employment in tourism or in construction industry, etc. for ages. Now somebody interposes a fancy app into the relationship, and suddenly policymakers are really interested in it and want to listen about it, right? So, and the same is true with bias in recruitment, for example, right? Human managers, human recruiters are terrible when it comes to biases. The kind of structural sexism and racism we see in the workplace has been discussed in the academic literature backwards and forwards for decades. Introduce AI, and suddenly people want to have the conversation again, right? So again, I'm not welcoming AI bias. I'm not welcoming the gig economy as an exploitative labor model, but it has raised the stakes when it comes to our political debates and when it comes to policymakers actually becoming really interested again in these fundamental topics. And that, I think, is a great effect of these technologies.
One of my favorite examples of this is actually Kate's work on explanation, right? We've all dealt with Kafkaesque systems, right, where we've been denied something or mistreated somehow by some opaque system that is convoluted and we can't understand. But we didn't have the language, we didn't have the moral grammar to make sense of that phenomena or to complain or to exercise rights about it. But Kate, I think when you developed that work, you were thinking at least partly about opacity in algorithms that may have played a part in motivating that kind of study, and sort of thinking about explainability in AI, black boxes, what is going wrong there when we are denied an explanation for an outcome. Now we're forced to have that conversation, and it ramifies, it reflects back on all these other kinds of processes in society which are opaque and unexplainable to us and may be a rights violation that we now better understand. Right? So AI provides this sort of useful stimulus. It's a mirror reflecting back on a variety of different problems we've neglected for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are often cases where, so I think it's the most interesting work on explanation and the right to explanation happened from lawyers. And I think the reason is often we have these tools in the law that they exist somewhere in some corner, like around, in the US, if you get denied for a loan, you're owed an explanation. And then we have this kind of tool, this legal practice that we can use and think, how does it fit in other domains? How do we need to change it? And that can lead us to actually maybe there's a more kind of general interest that people have in something like explanations. And it's not just, AI, again, brings this to light, makes it very stark. We think, well, oh gosh, I wouldn't like my life decided by a machine that I didn't understand. But you probably also wouldn't like it decided by a bureaucrat who's operating by rules that you don't understand and refuses to explain them to you. So yeah, I think a lot of old problems in new guises, but if we can get to interesting regulation and political solutions, then all the better.
Yeah, great. I'd like to open up the floor a bit to the audience. If you have a question or comment for the panel or one of the speakers, please signal and we'll send you a microphone. It is important that you speak into the microphone because we do have translation going on in the booths behind us.
If you speak very slowly and use language I learned in high school, I might be able to understand it.
Si quiere, puedo formularla. Bueno, la voy a formular en castellano, en español, porque mi inglés es muy rudimentario. La automatización de los puestos de trabajo tiene por lo menos 250 años de evolución desde que empezó la revolución industrial, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que los trabajadores llevan 250 años temiendo por su puesto de trabajo, y en estos momentos este temor que se expresa de que la inteligencia artificial va a incidir en esos puestos de trabajo, yo no tengo claro si esta reducción probable de puestos de trabajo es una continuación de la automatización que empezó hace 250 años, o bien consideran ustedes que realmente es un punto de inflexión y que realmente esto es algo que va a impactar de forma significativa en la evolución de estos puestos de trabajo.
Right. So the question was, if I could try and summarize, human beings have been worried about automation and labor market disruptions for a long time, starting, noticeably with the Industrial Revolution, where we worried that all of our jobs would disappear. That didn't happen. Is there something new about AI that gives us reason to have these fears or similar kinds of fears? Are they well-founded, or will they be disproven in the same way that prior fears have been? Okay.
Yeah, so, absolutely in line, and a really nice statement of this kind of economic orthodoxy that, look, when there's automation, in short term, some jobs go away, but in the long term, more jobs are created. We need complementary jobs for all of these technologies. So, think about people used to work in banks and count out banknotes for you. Now this job has gone away, right? You go to an ATM, it delivers some banknotes to you. But of course, we need people to service these machines, and so sometimes technology even creates higher skilled or higher paid jobs than the jobs that it automated away. So I think two things. I'm not sure. So in the past, I would have ended there. Now sometimes I think, look, a lot of the agents that we see are remarkable. The way that we can increasingly automate work in a way that produces sometimes, not always, quality outputs. If we can get to kind of agents that are able to perform a lot of tasks in the way that humans can, maybe that we're looking at a more significant automation of the economy. I just don't know. But even if you set that aside, you might say, just as in the Industrial Revolution, we had this group of people, the Luddites, who were smashing machines, not because they hated machines, but because it was totally disrupting their way of life and the social fabric. People used to, both men and women, produce in the home. There was a strong family unit. They didn't want these social changes. You might say, look, even if economically we'll be okay, we might want to ask ourselves, are the social changes that AI is going to produce worth it? Are we all much lonelier? Are we more stressed? Are we more isolated because our work is being managed by AI? And even if I have a job, right, is it a good job, or is it having these kind of negative social externalities? So, as far as like the short term or the kind of social impact, we may still have reason to worry even if the number of jobs is going to stay constant or increase in the long term.
Jeremias, you've just told us that the problems in the gig economy are sort of perennial or persistent, that there's not much new, maybe a sort of acceleration or amplification of problems that we've seen for a long time. But are there some novel challenges from AI that we should be concerned about?
Absolutely. I mean, in our work, we identify two broad categories of novel challenges, one relatively minor, one major. The minor one is what you might think of as information asymmetries in the workplace, right? So, and information asymmetries in particular in a way that traditional norms of employment and data protection law are not used to. So what I mean by an information asymmetry is essentially that an employer can suddenly know a lot more about a worker than the worker knows about the employer, right? And again, historically, that has always been sort of part of the equation, right? That's why you need to submit a CV when you apply for a job. That's why I collect, your information in a personnel file, etc. But now I can suddenly essentially monitor workers at no more cost to me. So there is, about a century ago, a famous sort of first management theory by a chap called Frederick Taylor, now known as Taylorism. He preferred the language of scientific management. And this idea was that, to optimize workplaces, you would measure exactly what every worker does and then compute it and surveil them in that way. The problem with Taylorism is the transaction cost involved, right? If I need to have a manager with a clipboard and a stopwatch standing behind every worker, even if I make some efficiency gains, that's never going to pay for all these managers doing all the surveillance. Well, that problem AI has solved, because now I can surveil my entire workforce in detail at every moment they are awake. Not just your workforce, also our students. I discovered not that long ago that Teams for Education has all sorts of creepy features that allow you to see when students read materials, how far they read the materials you set them, I've stopped using it because it's too depressing. Even in Oxford, they don't actually read the stuff we set them to do. Nonetheless, I think that kind of information asymmetry problem has changed quite seriously. And the second issue is what I was talking about today. So I think this demise of managerial agencies in our work is really the fundamental novel challenge that existing legal tools cannot grapple with. But again, it's really important and it's not the sexiest story to tell, but existing laws do matter and do apply, right? So we have in our project a whole track where we look at bias and discrimination, and there we are very much pushing the story that actually AI bias does not need new laws, does not need new rules. Actually, existing anti-discrimination norms can capture the problems that arise from AI.
Great. Another question from the audience?
Does this work? Hi. Yeah. Thank you. This is rather a strange, maybe playful question, but it's been something that I've been trying to iterate. So I'll read my question. When it comes to ethics, I think restoration is an interesting word, one that implies a going back to what it was in the past or to reclaim something, assuming that something was gone. So I'm curious if there's a perhaps speculative or speculative endeavor that puts forward a reimagination of what human autonomy, agency, and responsibility mean in this age. As storytelling species, I reckon we need a new story, and that's why we're here. And to find these new words that reimagine these ways in which we know, create, and maintain knowledge in our work. So I guess my question would be, if you could tell the tale of a new story, or to address how you see this regenerative and expansive relationship between us and our autonomy and AI.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I absolutely agree, and I think that in many ways, so, the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson, for example, argues that a lot of our theory and language around work was developed in the case of social conditions that no longer obtain. So she argues we kind of need new language in order to help us understand what are the moral interests and complaints that workers have and how can we deal with them in a kind of fair way. And I think technology is an interesting one. We're in a kind of interesting moment where this seems right. I mean, and, the most obvious cases are things like intimate relationships, so all of these topics that you've had already in this series. But I think work is a surprising but really important one. So I was very struck when I came to the topic of autonomy, that autonomy is really conceptualized as like control over work. And there you think, it's sort of it's almost a defensive, right? I have this boss, they're a tailorist, they're going to incur on my life, and I just need some control to help them back off. But I think the vision that you find that's more collaborative, that's more kind of let's get workers in, co-deciding, this is a very different notion of like collective autonomy or autonomy that's like highly relational with other people, and we need all of these conceptions as well. And I think it's really helpful and interesting to start from both social experiments of the past, so a lot of people have tried these kind of collective work, how did those go, but also the kind of metaphors that people use now in talking about AI and interrogate them and kind of see what's behind them.
Do you want to add?
My sort of happiest utopian vision story is one where we move quite radically to a world where we do far fewer things far better. I'm a professor and a researcher. I'm also, in a sense, a manager and a boss as associate dean of the law faculty, where I spend quite a lot of time thinking about the impact AI has on research and the kind of work we do as academics. And one thing that I'm very fascinated with at the moment, I also run a sort of seminar and workshop series on, is the kind of research we will be doing in a world of AI. And I think empirical work will always be something that people will do. But for the sort of more traditional legal scholarship, or I think fundamentally for the sort of more traditional social sciences scholarship, a lot of the sort of, additive, summative kind of work, that bots will be able to do. I think the kind of shift in the field, having a new innovation, that's the kind of thing. But also that's the sort of work you can't just keep punching out, right? That's the kind of work that needs space and needs time and needs lots of false starts. So my sort of best story is one where, we don't hear from Kate, or we don't hear from Ted for 2 or 3 years. But then every 2 or 3 years, there is the Redenberg piece at the moment, and then actually we all have time to read that, because then also, if we're all in this thing, then I will actually sit down, because I can't read everything that Kate and Ted write, because they write at such speed, right, as does everyone else. If there's only one piece every 2 or 3 years, at that point I'll actually print it out, sit down, have a cup of tea, and really read it and think about it. And that would be my sort of dream vision of the world I'd want to go to.
Great. Other questions? Yes.
Hola. Sí, bueno, ¿se me oye bien? Sí. Bueno, no sé si es una pregunta ya o un comentario un poco. Yo quería explicar un poco mi día a día. Para mí, yo trabajo con IA y realmente me ayuda mucho en mi trabajo diario, en lo que hablamos en calidad y también en automatizar muchas de las tareas que yo hago administrativas. Bien, igual pues el 30% de mi día lo reduce. Eso no significa que tenga 30% más para hacer otras cosas. Tengo un 30% más de volumen de trabajo que me dan, ¿vale? Y luego, yo, por ejemplo, estoy implementando un software, bien, en el cual, gracias a esta automatización de 14 personas, hemos reducido el equipo en 2. Entonces, 12 empleos de trabajo se han reducido en este equipo. Bien, es verdad que desde la revolución industrial se han ido automatizando tareas y es verdad que hemos ido reduciendo puestos de empleos, pero todo esto ha sido muy gradual. Nos encontramos que en cuestión de pocos meses o un año hay ciertas profesiones como todo lo que es de relación con la atención al público, traductores, arquitectos, todas las tareas administrativas, que se están reduciendo muchos empleos y no es de una manera gradual, es de una manera muy brutal, ¿bien? Entonces sí que se pueden generar nuevos empleos, pero no estamos al mismo nivel de velocidad, se reduce mucho más de lo que se está creando. Bien, esto por un lado, y luego, por otro lado, todo lo que es normativa, sí, se está creando normativa, pero todo lo que es IA va a una velocidad tan rápida, se pueden crear normas y adaptar las normas a esta velocidad en la cual la IA se está generando.
Right, so it goes back to some of the things we've been talking about, whether, this idea of flexibility offered by AI is in fact perhaps a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? Where it could in fact make us more productive and more flexible, but then, we get more work on top of that and are under pressure to be even more productive rather than to be able to take the time to go home early, as you say, or to attend to other things we might like to do during the day. I don't know if you have any...
Can I quickly intervene before you move on to the answer? Just because my question is very similar, I would like to avoid you answering twice to the same question.
Fair enough.
So I wrote it down, and so it says, so AI-driven productivity gains seem to open up to very different future of work. So at the end of the spectrum, on the one... Can you hear me? Yeah. So on the one end, there is higher output, where humans do less work but carry more responsibility and cognitive loads. And the other is the other keeps quality, reduce strain, and make work more human. So since capital incentives natural push towards maximizing output, what can legislation realistically do to influence which one of these futures we end up with?
Do you want to? I can.
Well, in a sense, I would return back to the sort of themes we've been talking about today, which is that I think insisting on human agency to some extent will put a limit on quantity. I don't think in any way, shape or form that will have a negative impact on productivity, right? In fact, there is a lot of evidence that having no constraints at all on innovation quickly leads to bad innovation, or actually, it would put it more positively, the best innovation tends to happen under certain resource constraints, right? And we can think of human agency and the need for humans before the loop, after the loop, above the loop, as one of the possible constraints to actually ensure societally beneficial innovation that then also shows up in productivity statistics. Think about this differently. If I have no constraint on how much labor I can deploy, then I don't actually need to invent particularly clever things. I just throw brute force at it, right? I mean, that's one of the stories behind the challenges with chip control, right? If I say, okay, fine, you no longer get, we had an AI race for a while where it looked like all AI race was going to be about was brute compute, right? Whoever had more compute was going to be ahead, right? Okay, then for various geopolitical reasons, we start turning off access to certain people for compute. Turns out that, fine, they can no longer play the let's just do maximum brute force compute game, but they go, okay, we'll have to do something different. We'll have to think about how we can accelerate AI models without access to brute compute. And there's nothing to me that suggests that looking at the workforce, it would be different. And then actually having certain, restraints wouldn't in the long run be productivity enhancing rather than be a drain on productivity.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize that we can look at existing cases where different countries or regions kind of diverged and figure out which policy levers might help. So again, to go back to the US and the EU, right, it was a bunch of working time directives, unionization in the EU, other regulation, but also taxes. So taxes play some role. If you're going to be taxed at 80% if you work those extra hours, are you really going to work versus take your leisure? So I think there are often a lot more policy instruments than we recognize as long as governments are willing to use them. And on the short-term point, we absolutely Acemoglu and Johnson, two economists, call this so-so automation. Automation where companies are trying to cut labor costs, and there's a kind of small increase in productivity because of it, but we're not seeing a huge jump and a huge boom. So there's really the question of, is productivity the only thing that we should be aiming at, or also are we measuring it in the right kind of way, even if it's the sort of growth that we want? Oftentimes, for example, traditional measures of productivity are really bad at detecting quality increases. But as a consumer, what you care about for your well-being is, was there actually a quality increase in this product or service or not? If it's not sort of picking this up, if companies are being rewarded for cutting labor costs but are not actually increasing the quality of their products, then we have a problem with how companies are incentivized to allocate, resources between capital and labor and then employ their labor force.
I think we can end on this optimistic note that there are, in fact, policy levers that we can activate to solve some of these problems that are, impending, as long as we are clear-eyed about the principles at stake, which is the work we've been doing in this discussion today, and the work we've been doing throughout this cycle of debates, to try to understand, what are the fundamental principles? How do we navigate these trade-offs during these uncertain times with this very, very powerful set of technologies? So thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you so much to Jeremias Adams-Prassl, to Kate Vredenberg. I've been Ted Lechtermam. It's been wonderful hosting this cycle of debates with Fundación La Caixa. Thank you all. Have a great evening.